Hello, and welcome to Ardent Talks, Regeneration and Development, Episode 3. In the summer, which, as it's cold and raining outside during this recording, feels like a pretty long time ago, the government set out further detail of its overhaul of the planning system, with the publication of a much-anticipated update to the National Planning Policy Framework, or NPPF. Those proposals were in the form of an 8-week consultation that ran until the 24th of September of this year. In this podcast, we're going to delve into some of the details of the key proposals, and we'll give some thoughts on what these updates might mean for the planning and development industry. It's a really interesting topic area, and we're joined by Giles and Sheridan Treger of BCLP, as well as Jon Stott of Ardent, to help navigate the proposals. So let's get started. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. The government have continually cited housing and planning as central to its growth, indeed central to its economic growth strategy. And this is clear from the fact that Rachel Reeves, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, has been a key part of the narrative of economic growth through planning and development, which has led to some of these proposed reforms. To help run us through the proposals, I'm joined by Ardent's Group Managing Director and featured guest of our first podcast episode, Jon Stott. I'm also joined for the first time by Giles and Sheridan Treger of Brian Cave Leighton Paisner's Planning and Zoning team. The BCLP planning team is ranked as a Band 1 practice in Chambers and Partners, who know that the team is one of the best resourced in the country with a number of ranked individuals. The firm guides a broad portfolio of projects through all stages of the planning process, from preliminary advice to high court challenges, and frequently engages on high-profile and complex matters, including nationally significant infrastructure projects and large residential-led development. In fact, Giles is one of those ranked individuals with a testimonial stating that he is a consummate professional, combining a friendly and practical approach with the ability to explain complex matters in layman's terms. Sheridan is also included by Legal 500 as a key individual in the team, with clients noting that he is an amazing lawyer with good humour, who is technically excellent and with fantastic people skills. Again, importantly for a podcast, he is reported to be able to make some very dry and complex areas of planning interesting and understandable. So perfect for a podcast. We're very grateful that you both agreed to join this episode, so thank you very much and welcome.
We're very excited to be here, and if I may say, we're waiting for the podcast to be renamed. The rest is Regeneration, and when it gets bought out by the big boys, we're happy to take a share.
No reply from Gary Lineker yet, but I'll keep emailing. A first key step to realising the aims of proposals, and I'll just mention the statement by Rachel Reeves at the Labour Party conference recently, which was, what in your town, your city, is a sight that we have not seen often enough in our country: shovels in the ground, cranes in the sky, the sounds and the sights of the future arriving. We will make that a reality. I guess one of the first key steps to realising this aim are the proposals for updating the NPPF. What is the overarching aim and ambition of the proposed changes to the NPPF, and what is the government trying to achieve?
Maybe I'll tackle that one. So I think many of your listeners will know exactly what the NPPF is, but it's worth just saying it's national planning policy. It's the National Planning Policy Framework. Local plans are local planning policy, and they too have to align with the NPPF. So one way or the other, decision makers have to decide planning applications in accordance with the NPPF, unless there's some material considerations strong enough to outweigh it. But local authorities do have pretty wide planning judgments as to where the planning balance lies in any application across all of the issues. So supported NPPF changes aren't a guaranteed ticket to a particular consent, but case officers in planning departments, for everything everyone says, they do tend to be pretty objective and follow policy. So this strengthens your scheme. And if there's political opposition in a council, this is a useful thing to have on your side. And obviously it's very useful on appeal. So zooming back out to your question, what is this all about? You mentioned Angela Rayner gave an address to Parliament. You cited some of the things that she said, but she was very upfront what this is all about. I'm not a political analyst. As a firm, we have no party political views, but it's obvious that planning policy doesn't exist in a vacuum. Labour won a landslide. It doesn't necessarily feel like it won a landslide. Their vote apparently is, for various reasons, basically the same as it was under Jeremy Corbyn. So they are very keen to deliver economic growth, as their number one mission is not education, is growth, because they recognise if they don't, they'll be sensitive to accusations that they're just raising taxes and just shuffling existing wealth around. You need growth to be able to tax growth. And one way to deliver growth is what you said, getting a spade in the ground, getting Britain building. They want to raise living standards for everyone everywhere and sort out public services. And they also obviously want to really deliver for their base, for working people. And a lot of that is going to be about affordable homes. But another element layered on top of that is Angela Rayner, when she spoke to Parliament, talked about making it easier to build infrastructure. I'm not an economist, I'm not a political analyst, but hey, I'll have a go. It seems to me, in macroeconomic terms, Britain has been stumbling around a bit since it deconstructed its manufacturing and mining base in the 70s, looking for the next big thing to fuel the economy in a very changing global and technology context. North Sea oil and gas, that was a bridge to the 80s and 90s, but it's gone. The 2008 crash means government really many governments have wanted to diversify from financial services. So Ms. Rayner has singled out trying to make it easier to build labs, gigafactories, data centers, and electric grid connections in this NPPF consultation, because Labour is trying to promote the new biotech and high-tech economy as the way forward for Britain. She also wants to make it simpler and faster to build clean energy sources to meet zero carbon energy generation by 2030. It's part that industrial strategy involves Britain becoming like a green superpower. And that's part of fueling new towns and the new economy. But I think we can unpack all of these things to use some corporate speak as we move along.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because I think there's a tendency, especially online and LinkedIn, a lot of the articles that I read is a focus on housing. And we will be focusing the first part of this podcast on housing. But as you say, a lot of the narrative, both coming out of government and coming out of the NPPF, is a kind of holistic improvement of a number of facets of society, energy, transport, etc., community facilities that sit alongside that, and trying to reform and stimulate growth and development in all those areas at the same time, which is quite a challenge, but it's good to see it being addressed as a single package. Moving back, as I said in the first part of this podcast, to housing, obviously there's been a lot of talk about housing targets and those being missed, both through multiple governments. We're still in a position where we're significantly below the targets for submitted and consented planning applications in respect of housing, which obviously are required to meet housing targets. If you don't have a permission, you can't build anything, so there will be no supply. One proposal is to try and increase housing development. Housing development is the reinstatement of the 5-year housing land supply. But why has that been reinstated, and why is that important?
Rob, let me take that one. I think you could probably select any year in the last decade plus and mention 5-year housing land supply, and these issues come round and round again. So let's strip it back a little bit to the first principles. As part of your local plan policy making, as part of a local planning authority's responsibility and duty to ensure that it has an up-to-date development plan, it's got to look at what development, and in this case residential development, it requires during the plan period. So it looks at economic growth factors, it looks at population growth factors, it looks at the need for housing, what sort of housing, all of those factors. And then it goes through that process. Then it's got to look at how much land do I have available that is suitable, that's viable, that can deliver this development that we have demonstrated we need. And as part of that process, the 5-year housing land supply principle exists, and will, as you say, will shortly exist again. And the intention here is to, at a strategic level, to be able to provide confidence that you have the land available to deliver the development that the particular local area needs during an extended period of time. In this particular case, the government is also going to restore the 5% buffer on housing land supply, which was eroded over time, together with maintaining the 20% buffer. So if you are a local authority who has a poor track record for delivering housing in the recent past, then you will be required to demonstrate that you can provide more, 20% more land for delivery. And the purpose fundamentally is we all recognize the difficulties in delivering development, and just because you allocate a site, it doesn't mean it's going to get delivered within a plan period. So that's fundamentally what this is about. Government is taking a very novel approach, which is we're going to put houses, or we're going to plan to put houses where they can be delivered, rather than actually where we would, in a completely theoretical world, where we would like to have them. So that's quite an interesting pragmatic approach. Let's see if that pragmatic approach can withstand the realities of development and planning, which we all know has done for reform in the past. To your question, why it's important, only to make sure that there is sufficient land for development, but also that it is done in a controlled way. If you do not have an up-to-date local plan, if you do not have enough land, then developers come along and speculate, and they say, right, we will force development on a site of our choosing, on terms of our choosing, and we'll take you to appeal local authority, and we will probably win, or possibly win. And it's to avoid that uncontrolled, disorderly approach to local development that makes the 5-year housing land supply, the availability of land, so important.
Great. And you mentioned in the local development planning process the consideration of types of housing. We're going to talk later in the podcast about affordable housing and where housing can be delivered. And my first question on that really is another term we've heard a lot in the last decade or so, brownfield first. That's obviously one of the proposals for where housing should be prioritised. What are the proposals to prioritise development on these sites? And what's the intention of the brownfield passport? So it was mentioned in the NPPF consultation, and then in a rather clunky fashion, a further working paper was released on the passport 2 days before the end of the consultation. Is there any more detail that really takes it forward?
The risk of repeating myself about these kind of old tropes coming back, brownfield first has been there it's an easy thing to say politically. Everybody likes it as an idea. Everybody realizes that it's the better option to have land that has been previously developed, that is served by infrastructure already. You have a local population expectation of that site being used for development because it looks like it has been. So overall, what's not to like? It comes with challenges. There are usually abnormal development costs associated with it for one reason or another, not least because if it was easy to deliver, it would have been delivered by now. But sometimes it requires cleanup. It requires additional and new infrastructure connection, which can make it quite tricky. And sometimes local authorities aren't willing to give it the special policy treatment it requires. Brownfield land often should be much more dense than it, in terms of development, than it is, and that local authorities are willing to see. So all of that stuff explains why it's a perennial topic for conversation. In terms of a brownfield passport, it sounds great, doesn't it? It sounds like a great thing.
Wave them through.
Exactly, just wave it through. You can just have a development license as you like. Process of something called a local development order has been in place for years and years, and many developments have been delivered through local development orders in some way, shape or form. And effectively, what government is saying is that the brownfield passport will be a clear market indication that certain sites can be brought forward for certain development at certain densities, delivering certain things. All of the development is the risk around the principle of development is removed, and then you just have to get certain details approved. They have pointed to local development orders as being the existing statutory framework by which that can be delivered. They're coining the phrase brownfield passport. It will be interesting to see whether they are actually anticipating anything new in terms of some sort of, they're just saying, well, you can use local development orders and you can send this signal. And just in case listeners aren't aware, a local development order is a statutory order for a particular geographical location promoted by the local authority. And it says development of this sort is acceptable in principle, but you must comply with these parameters, comply with the design code obligations, and submit details for approval that are really just the nuts and bolts of the delivery of it. So it's almost like a standing outline consent, if you like, for development. So it will be interesting to see whether government has just coined a fancy phrase that sounds great, or actually whether there is something behind it, because at the moment we don't really have much information.
Yeah, that's helpful. And as you say, passport sounds great. It sounds like an automatic consent, and it's definitely being brought forward. But yeah, as you say, it's been made clear that it's not an automatic consent. And what will be interesting is, yeah, if you've got a passport, how difficult is the visa process going to be to actually get something taken forward? And just picking up on something you said earlier about brownfield sites, if they were ripe and ready for coming forward and there were no other constraints, they probably would have. That's my experience working with brownfield sites outside of the green belt, that more often than not, there are significant remediation or other issues that make the development or the viability process difficult to stack up and bring forward. That's for brownfield outside of the green belt, which helpfully leads us on to the proposals for previously developed land within the green belt. So I think the first kind of basic question is, what is the green belt? And by contrast, what is the new proposed grey belt? And what are the government's proposals for development in this area? I keep hearing and reading about these new golden rules. Are terms like grey belt, golden rules, and brownfield passport, like you said, just fancy branding, or is there some substance? It on first read, it smells a little bit like conservative levelling up, which in many cases was more of a brand than a policy. Are we looking at the same kind of situations?
There's been a lot in the press about green belt, grey belt. What does it mean? Whenever there is talk about development in the green belt, it raises a significant level of interest nationally, locally, partly because interested parties who make a lot of noise are parties with vested interests in nice parts of the urban fringe around the country, and they would like to keep it that way. Thank you. I read these provisions, partly, yes, which we'll come on to, as the making available land, but also a bit of a warning to local authorities who aren't working hard enough to make brownfields within the urban area available for development, or other sites that aren't green belts available for development. And they're effectively saying, if you can't demonstrate land supply for development over the plan period, you must look at the green belt. And by the way, that's land supply exercising your duty to cooperate. There's talk about bringing back regional, a more spatial approach to planning, which again harks back in to time gone by. You will be looking at the green belt, according to government, if you don't have enough land available by other means. Currently, there is not just you do not need to, as part of your local plan review the green belt boundary. There's you shall not do unless, and you certainly shan't release land from the green belt unless there are exceptional circumstances to do. And so what government is saying is, actually, if you don't have the land available, as part of your local plan review, you will look at the green belt boundary. You will look for what we call grey belt. Now, green belt, the principle is not that it's got some sort of environmental protection. There are other designations for that, or environmental importance. There are other designations for that. It's not that it has a particular natural beauty. There are other designations for that. The purpose of the green belt, which is why existing green belts encircle big urban areas, is to check uncontrolled urban sprawl, to maintain openness between settlements, which is why there's a big donut around London. There are donuts around Birmingham and Liverpool and other areas around the country. Of distinguishing between green belt that serves this purpose and green belt that doesn't serve this purpose, or serves it to a limited extent, is the distinction that government is trying to draw here. So they're trying to allocate and define grey belt land as potentially previously developed land within the green belt or not, but for whatever reason, it's land that doesn't contribute or only contributes to a limited extent to that purpose of maintaining openness, mean that I think this is all a bit of a storm in a teacup, which are the golden rules. It's actually going to be pretty difficult both to find a meaningful amount of grey belt land to take out of the green belt allocation, but also the golden rules mean that you have to, on these sites, deliver 50% affordable housing at an appropriate tenure, which means some sort of social rent contribution, that they are well served with infrastructure, that they will contribute to or improve the local green space provision and access to green space. So those three golden rules are key tenets here. And it's really quite difficult then to see, not only do you have to demonstrate the character of the land falls within the definition, but then that it is able to deliver on this, on these golden rules. And there's no distinction at all between whether that is grey belt land that comes forward through speculative applications or through local plan policy. There's no recognition that local authorities should be competent enough themselves to be able to say, actually, for these grey belt sites that we're going to release from the green belt, we think a slightly different approach should be taken in terms of what affordable housing level they should provide, because there might be specific, effectively apply at a local level, exceptions to the golden rules. It's to be quite frank, I don't think the policy is going to be as effective as government hopes. I don't think it's going to be nearly as controversial as all of the press make out.
That's really interesting. So the golden rules effectively might end up stagnating or making it extremely difficult to find sites that can actually be brought forward within the green belt, or sites that are newly designated as grey belt because of this 50% affordable housing requirement, the necessary improvements required to local infrastructure, schools, I'm assuming that's schools, health facilities, transport links, etc. And then, ironically, taking land out of the green belt and then providing new or improved local green spaces as part of that development. So I guess that talks back to what we mentioned earlier about, you said, where is housing looking to be delivered and what type of housing? And this is where we have an indication of the government wants, if they're going to be agreeing to bring sites out of the green belt or consent land within the green belt for development, for a significant quantum of affordable housing to be provided. Is there any more information about how the government is going to seek to deliver more affordable housing through the proposals?
Yes, so we've mentioned the golden rule about 50%. I think the other point to note, which is important, is the recognition that tenure, we've all had these arguments where there's a zero-sum game, isn't there? If you deliver affordable housing, do you prioritize unit numbers or habitable rooms? Do you prioritize the right tenure mix? Because there are some tenures, obviously, that are more expensive to deliver and have a bigger impact on viability than others. I think over the course of time, previous administrations have migrated towards first homes policy and mandatory provision of first homes, shared ownership, the idea of getting on the property ownership ladder through affordable means, which I think is very different to and has led arguably to a real pause and crisis in the delivery of other sorts of, in inverted commas, more affordable tenures, such as affordable rent or social rent. And so what government is saying, or at least what we can infer from the consultation paper, is that government is emphasizing the importance of the right tenure.
Yep.
So increase in affordable rent, increase in social rent, see whether they're willing also then to say at the expense of unit numbers. They seem to be implying that you can have, that they would rather you had fewer they're willing to take an overall percentage hit as long as the right tenure is delivered. That's quite a politically bold thing to actually see through. My view is that they've got to see that through, because if they want to see more social rent and more affordable rent, something will have to give, but in the planning balance. So I think that is the key point to mention here. They're abandoning the first homes mandate, and we will see whether we get a meaningful delivery of genuinely affordable homes.
And I think that probably links in, I guess, with my and Jon's side of the picture. And obviously one of the things that has to give to be able to provide more affordable housing, social rent, is build costs. We can't do much about those. That's the market. And land values that are being paid for sites, allowing for, if you acquire a site at a lower value, obviously there's more skin in the game to be able to provide more affordable housing at a viable level to bring a scheme forward. The proposals specifically say Greenbelt lands can deliver more affordable housing, infrastructure and environmental contributions, because the value of the land in its existing use in their assessment is generally low, and the Greenbelt designation reduces the hope value associated with the prospect of securing planning permission. Obviously, the first thing to say there is the market does what the market does, and having new designations or willingness to be able to consent sites within the Greenbelt will necessarily impact what someone in the market will pay for a site. And the way that the proposals try and limit that is by consulting on the imposition of benchmark land values. And we can only talk about that on a very high level basis, because the proposals indicate that it might be reasonable for those to be somewhere between 10 and 40 times existing use value, which obviously are very different valuation pictures. It's a rather wide range. It's something that people have very strong opinions on, because setting benchmark land values is complex, is controversial, it's necessarily locally relevant, and it'll be difficult to apply them on a national basis because land values in the southeast are going to be extremely different to the northwest, by examples, and it could lead to unintended consequences. If it's too high, ironically, affordable housing might suffer. If it's too low, landowners may just withhold sites in high demand areas, because the implication is if you acquire a site for above the benchmark land value, it is assumed that the site will therefore not be viability tested, and you can afford 50% affordable housing. There'll be no subject to viability tests. So frankly, it might just lead landowners to not sell sites, because developers won't want to pay for a site above the benchmark land value, because they'll get, in their view, stung on viability and affordable housing. The other interesting thing, I think, to come out, and that I think the whole planning world probably breathed a sigh of relief on, is there's going to be a focus on improving existing developer contributions, so SIL where relevant, MSIL where relevant, and Section 106, and that the infrastructure levy included within LURA is not going to be implemented, which I think is just going to take another very complex mechanism to try and implement out of the picture, which I think everyone would be quite happy about.
Yeah. In all of that, Rob, one of the questions that kind of leaps out to me when you look at the suggestions around the benchmark values and those potentially being significantly lower, and which I think will lead to the point you've just mentioned, which is that landowners will not be prepared to make their land available for development, even if it falls within the grey belt category. Does that mean we think that we may see increased use of compulsory purchase powers to facilitate that? If, for example, hope value is disapplied when using compulsory purchase powers, is that something we expect to see more of to enable these sorts of projects to come forward?
It's quite interesting into CPO and what is the appetite for compulsory purchase. And you mentioned the LURA Levelling Up and Regeneration Act's power to be introduced to be able to direct that in certain schemes that are underpinned by CPO, compensation will have particular rules set as to whether or not and how hope value will be regarded in establishing that compensation for the land that is taken. And it's going to be very interesting. As CPO practitioners, all of us, we're going to sit back and watch the first scheme or two that come forward, relying on that direction and the litigation that may well follow it. So CPO fits into what there are, and there have been, to be fair, up through and including LURA, there are various CPO powers that are available and have always been available at the local level with local planning authorities, at a more strategic level with Homes England, with development corporations. So these powers have existed for many years, and they continue to exist. What I think has been lacking in some cases is the wherewithal the capability and the political courage to actually, and that's political with a small p, not party political, with the political courage to actually take the steps to resource and promote orders. Government is, through this consultation, is, I think, hinting that it is expecting a much more interventionist approach from the public sector in terms of use of CPO powers. I think that's to be applauded. I hope that as we see decisions come through, that government and the Secretary of State will be sufficiently courageous in order to be able to take a positive approach to that. I've certainly heard from various different places that there will be a more fundamentally, if you're going to bring forward the sort of levels of housing, 300,000 homes a year or 1.5 million through the 5-year period, you are going to need to look at both local sites, and that's using CPO powers to unpick the few difficult landowners that are preventing a whole allocated scheme come forward, or the entire planning and delivery of new towns and new settlements through development corporations and other structures or significant urban extensions. We are going to need Homes England and development corporations to exercise CPO powers. And my understanding is that there is a much greater appetite, both in terms of government support for that, but also in terms of the willingness within those organisations to promote orders. So it will be really interesting to see.
There's an interesting interaction, isn't there, between the golden rules and the hope value disapplication requirements, because to be able to apply for those directions, the scheme needs to be providing significant affordable housing or education or health facilities. And two of the golden rules, one is 50% affordable housing requirement, and the other one is the necessary infrastructure being promoted, including potentially education and health facilities. So that might twin together quite nicely, and it might actually act as an incentive to those landowners that if there is a risk of a CPO being brought at existing use value because of the disapplication of hope value, that might be the incentive to bring those, at the moment, landowners that haven't been able to get on the same page to come together and promote a scheme or apply for a consent together, rather than the public sector having to intervene.
Yeah, that threat needs to be real, though, doesn't it? I think it's important, as you say, Giles, that the combined authorities, Homes England, are prepared to be interventionist and use the powers that are available to them, because I think otherwise they're not prepared to do that. And I suspect some landowners will sit back and not be prepared to bring their sites forward, make them available for development, and they'll wait till 5 or 10 years pass and another new government comes in and they bring new legislation in which is more favourable to landowners. But we'll see. I do hope we see an increased use of compulsory purchase powers, or at least a greater appetite to use those powers, because they're there to facilitate precisely what we need. And in this case, it's more housing. Aside from housing, Rob mentioned earlier more broadly the government's growth aspirations, and that's looking at introducing more gigafactories, freight and logistics sites, etc. What are we seeing in the proposals that will help to support developments of that sort of nature?
So I'll talk to that. So what this ties into is what we discussed at the beginning. What is the next big thing for Britain's economy looking far into the future? And that's supposed to be tied together in this concept of a forthcoming industrial strategy. And you summarized what those things are. They're set out in detail on the face of the consultations. You've got data centers. We all know what those are, but they're facilities hosting network computer servers that store and process data at scale. And I think the interesting thing to pick out there is that if artificial intelligence is the future and deploying it at scale is key for Britain's economy, the only real obstacle to it is not having enough servers. So it's more important than just saving the pictures off your phone. Then you've got gigafactories. And I was joking with a friend, try to get that into my next Scrabble game with my mum. It is a real word, but it basically means very large scale manufacturing facilities. And it's normally actually used in the context of factories for rechargeable batteries that go into electric vehicles. Everyone used to say we want to be more like the Germans with a heavy manufacturing base that does complex machinery. But apparently electric vehicles don't really need complex physical machinery. It's all about the battery that makes up the majority of the base of the car. And I was told the other day by a garage mechanic, if you do have one of these cars, don't run over anything, because if you damage that battery, you might as well buy a new electric car. So this is something that Britain could do. You need to get someone who understands tariffs and subsidies on next time, though, because I'm not sure how we're supposed to compete with certain major nations who are apparently dead set to flood our economy and the West with very cheap and good electric batteries. But I'm sure that has been thought through. Then you've got labs for life sciences, and actually we've got a lot of clients who do that kind of thing, precision medicines, quantum technologies, and obviously all of that's linked with AI as well. And then you've got good old freight and logistics, which is about a national network tying all of these things together. And so the NPPF is supposed to be aligning planning policies to reflect the priorities of these sectors. If I read off what the consultation proposes, it says governments looking to make the NPPF give more explicit recognition of the need for local plan policies and decisions to support proposals for new or upgraded facilities and infrastructure, including these sectors we've discussed. The NPPF is proposed to say that decision makers must ensure that supply chains, transport innovation, and decarbonization are considered in terms of the locational requirements of these sectors. Councils are expected to identify commercial sites for these key growth industries in their local plans and positively consider them in planning decisions when they are of local, regional, or national importance. So part of me thinks, what does that really add? We spoke about how the NPPF fits into councils, how they take decisions, the planning balance, and that seems to me warm, fuzzy stuff. But if you think that the bandwidth of councils to take decisions is pretty wide, their planning judgment is pretty wide, policy just gives them nudges, like, go there, go there. It's like a kind of game of blind man's buff, but in terms of planning policy. Then nothing there, to my mind, screams out you must give particular weight to this as such. It's still, I think, a straight up planning balance to some degree. So the other idea that they moot for the consultation isn't actually to do with the NPPF at all. It's to do with allowing data centers, gigafactories, labs into the DCO, the Development Consent Order consenting regime. So instead of the local planning authority deciding your application for planning permission, you'd go to the Secretary of State and you'd say, we're not applying to the local authority. We'd like you to direct under Section 35 of the Planning Act 2008 that we can apply directly to a government department for a development consent order instead of a planning commission. Now, the Planning Act 2008 was created to provide a fast-track, one-stop shop, as they like to call it, for nationally significant infrastructure projects. But that initially was a very constrained concept, and it was aimed at energy, transport, wastewater, and water schemes, which were above certain thresholds that made them nationally significant. Then government introduced scope to get a range of business and commercial schemes directed in. And that was a bit of a list which kind of overlaps a bit with these key growth sectors: office use, research, R&D, basically, industrial processes, storage and distribution, conferences, exhibitions, leisure, tourism. And if you were of a substantial size, or you had a significant economic impact or important for driving growth was an important thing, strangely then, you could get directed into this fast track regime. But the reality has been that it's not been very used for those kinds of schemes where it's been, they could choose, because the process has some very big upsides, not unlike what Giles was talking about before about using CPO to unlock certain housing schemes. Because if you get a DCO, you don't need the local authority to promote the CPO for you, or Homes England. You can do it yourself. So if you have land assembly issues, you can get your own CPO without the local authority or Homes England or whoever. If you've got highways issues and there's an uncollaborative highway authority, there's a range of highway works powers, and you can deem in a Section 278 agreement, a highways agreement. So very nice. And you get a pretty depoliticized, fixed 6-month examination instead of the uncertainty of local determination, local politics, or potentially a never-ending public inquiry. But the key to the certainty of outcome of those DCOs, more than 90% have been granted in terms of those kind of utilities-type infrastructure pieces and roads and things. The base of that was a solid set of national policy statements, because the Secretary of State needs to determine applications in accordance with the policy statement, except in a limited number of circumstances. But they've never covered the business and commercial schemes I've just listed, and they don't cover these key growth sectors. So unless you've got a particular highways problem or land assembly problem or a very solid kind of local politics issue, it's not always been obvious why you should go through a regime that requires a heavy degree of front loading and is quite resource intensive if you don't have to. It will be good for some schemes, but not all. And if you were a desirable jobs generating and placemaking business commercial scheme, with local authority support, you probably didn't need to go for a DCO. Now, what I would say is there may be circumstances where a local authority says, this is very politically tough for us, but we have no real problem with your scheme, really. Why don't you just ask the Secretary of State to direct you in? And strangely, we will just be broadly supportive during the DCO determination. So I think that there is some use in this. I think it'll help unlock a few schemes. But I think the real message here is probably not of process. It's of, we want these things to happen. And this is what we're doing in the planning to make them happen. And then you can bring on people to talk about the other things government will do to help make these things happen in terms of what we mentioned, tariffs and subsidies and all manner of things like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I was going to move on to DCOs and particularly talking about renewable energy, but perhaps not one for now, maybe another podcast at some other point. I've always felt that perhaps housing in new towns should be perhaps brought into the DCO process, and that's maybe the best way for us to be consenting for new towns, but we'll see. I think there's mixed views around whether they should be decided, those sorts of decisions should be decided locally or nationally. But in terms of DCOs, one thing they are used very heavily for at the moment is renewable schemes. I think about 60% of the projects going through the NPPF regime is for renewable energy projects at the moment. And it'd be helpful if you're able just to cover what the NPPF has said in relation to renewable energy projects and what we think it will mean for that sector going forward.
So now we're talking about Britain as a green energy superpower. The Saudis will have oil, the Americans will have shale, and we'll have windy jackets and all the sunshine that the UK delivers on a daily basis. And the NPPF does talk about that, and Angela Rayner spoke about that. You've got to take a step back to understand what Labour is doing. So the Conservatives embedded a very high bar for consenting onshore wind schemes to be granted into the NPPF. To be acceptable, they had to be in areas allocated in a local plan, and they had to have proven community support. And that's being scrapped. The Conservatives also removed onshore wind from the DCO regime, which you've mentioned, under the Planning Act. So developers were left with local decision-making and that high bar in the NPPF. They couldn't go for a centrally made decision by the Secretary of State into the Planning Act. Now government's looking to reintegrate onshore wind into the DCO regime, and that must lead to more consent. A lot of what we're talking about here is just shuffling paper around, but that must lead to more because effectively the tap was turned off. The NPPF, frankly, was already pretty supportive of planning applications for renewable and low carbon development. Applicants under the last government didn't need to demonstrate the overall need for renewable or low carbon energy, and the NPPF said applications should be approved if impacts or can be made acceptable. But this government's looking to take that quite a fair bit further, directing that decision makers give significant weight to the benefits associated with renewable and low carbon energy generation and proposals' contribution to meeting a net zero future. We spoke before, I naughtily said, policy can be a bit of a blind man's buff and the kid pointing you in directions without telling you exactly what you have to do for local authorities in terms of their planning judgment. And so this phrase, significant weight, I think stops everything being a kind of a level playing field of all the material considerations in the policy being the same. I don't think it's quite the same as great weight, which the NPPF says you've got to give to conserving heritage assets or the benefits of mineral extraction. But significance still is more than just a standard material consideration. So I think that is a policy change. It's not going to be just a flat balancing exercise. Also, local authorities have to proactively identify sites for renewable and low carbon development when producing local plans. And so that'll give a bit of an impetus to the market because people have certainty that they're not going off on one with speculative application if that's been designated for that purpose in policy. And the NPPF would also be clear that development of renewables may be proposed in sensitive areas. And that includes, specifically, invaluable habitats like peat. But then it says subject to environmental safeguards. I suspect those are still going to be constraints, but it doesn't mean that they're no-go areas anymore. And I spotted, for some other purpose, the other day, that about 10% of UK land space is peatland. So that would unlock quite a new area. But that's the NPPF. Let's zoom out a bit in terms of the different consenting regimes. The government's also looking at raising the thresholds at which solar and onshore wind projects can be considered to be nationally significant infrastructure projects and thus be determined centrally under the Planning Act 2008. As I mentioned, there are significant upsides to the DCO regime, but it is definitely more resource intensive with very high standards for everything, more than a standard planning application. I'm aware of a DCO project, a potentially DCO project, where because the threshold test in statute was a bit subjective on a particular point, they could go either way, but weren't really sure where they had to go. But they didn't need any CPO, they didn't need any particular highways. And so frankly, and frankly, there were very limited impacts. So after some initial engagement with the DCO process and all of its requirements, they were basically being compelled to follow a lot of the same steps as you would have to if you were a nuclear power station. And they said, look, this isn't for us. We're going to rejig this project a bit, and we're going to go back to the local authority who, other than nervousness about the legalities of the threshold test, have no problem with us and would really quite welcome what we're trying to do. So it's not for everyone. And I think government's a bit mindful of that on solar and onshore wind projects, because the threshold at the moment is whether they have a generating capacity of more than 50 megawatts. And now solar panels are apparently more efficient. You get greater megawatt yield per site, and onshore wind turbines are also bigger and more powerful. So that means that a lot of these cheaper and smaller scale onshore wind and solar projects are now being sucked into this very useful regime, but one which is aimed at big ticket stuff. And in the case of solar, the consultation points out that government thinks this is distorting the market, because there's lots of ground mounted solar capacity being decided under the town and country planning system by local authorities. And it all just happens to be just fractionally under 50 megawatts per threshold of the threshold. And that's not a coincidence. But at the same time, I think you mentioned the DCO regime is awash with very big 150 megawatt plus solar projects. So that gives you a sense that for certain schemes, they understand and it's helpful to them actually to go through the DCO process. But that kind of wedge in the middle of capacity, government's worried, is being lost by the market being unduly constrained by the system. And so they've said that they're consulting on changing the threshold, knocking it up for onshore wind to 100 megawatts and knocking it up for solar projects to 150 megawatts. So that's going to lead to a lot more of this stuff ending up with local authorities.
Interesting. I do wonder if they do that. I wonder how many 149.9 megawatt solar schemes we might see come forward. Because it feels like a fairly arbitrary threshold to me. In our response, we made the point that perhaps rather than having a threshold that's as stringent as being proposed for wind and for solar, perhaps it just should be an assumption that if it's under 50 megawatts, it goes through TCPA, and an assumption perhaps if it's over 150, in most cases it'll go through the DCO regime, but actually leave the developers to decide what's appropriate, because there'll be site-by-site differences, site-specific issues that might mean one regime is appropriate for one site that's 100 megawatts compared to another that's 100 megawatts, for example. So we think perhaps leaving flexibility in there might be more appropriate than setting the fixed thresholds, but I don't know what your views are around that.
I think it's a very clever idea, because thinking about it, that assumes that local authorities are content to consent these schemes themselves. And the reality is, I think they're often very grateful that some of these schemes politically are directed centrally. Yeah. But that may not be the case in every time. And if developers can have a conversation with the local authority and say, are you content for this to proceed? Then that's a good idea. And your idea is actually better than saying they could be directed in, because that just creates an extra hurdle. You've got to now justify to the Secretary of State what's appropriate to be directed in or not. And it just let people opt in voluntarily. I think that is a good idea.
Thank you. Sorry to throw that in.
No, you gave the summary I was going to give.
There you go. We're probably moving towards the end of the allotted time that we've got for the podcast. We've covered a lot of ground, from housing to gigafactories to Scrabble to renewable energy as well. We've covered a lot there. I think it's been really helpful. Go back to what Rob talked about at the outset in terms of the mood music that's coming from Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, Rachel Reeves, etc. They're talking a lot about radical changes. And I just wonder, actually, how radical do we think that all of this is? Do we think that we're revisiting quite a few perhaps old ideas, or do we think this is going to make a real big difference? Are we going to get to a point, do you see us getting to a point where we can deliver, let's look at housing, 300,000 units per year? And are these changes that they're consulting on at the moment, are they going to help to take us there, or other things that are going to be needed? I wonder what your views are.
So I'm interested in it's being used, but actually about its irrelevance to what we around this table are all about. We're about making things happen. And I have great fun reading history books in my spare time. And left-wing governments across the world have always tended to identify and advertise themselves as radical since the French Revolution. Because what is the point of the left-wing movement if you're not radical? You're not about conserving things necessarily, albeit the realities are as they are. So I don't think we need to bother about the question of radical. The question to me really, that governments just shuffle paper around, they talk radically, but at the end of the day, there's only a narrow range of actual practical solutions to fixing the problems Britain has in its economy through the planning system. Do all governments basically talk big, or is it just about laws and policies, and where does that go? So I don't think I'm too worried about the question of radicalism, but what's achievable. And I think actually what's interesting is there opportunity in development because of the difference between the parties, and that we've got this party. Because all governments, they come to power with good intentions. They want to govern for the nation, but they've got to listen, like any business, to their customers. And so that they end up governing their natural constituencies. So they govern for their natural constituencies, that the lot who vote for them or might vote for them, and not really the lot who don't. And I think here there is an opportunity, because if we go back to the various conservative white papers, initially they were very radical. They mooted very radical deregulation, Hong Kong style zoning, where if you basically adhere to certain parameters, which are pretty loose, you can build whatever you want in that particular zone. And somehow environmental and heritage regulatory stuff will just sort itself out in a parallel regime. But then that got dropped because the radical libertarianism of the Conservative Party ran smack bang into the traditionalist instincts of the people who actually vote Conservative in the shires. You can imagine the calls from constituency MPs to the policy wonk saying, you're proposing what in my area? Do you need my seat? And then if you think about the sections of communities in those constituencies and what they really wanted, did they really want lots of affordable flats in their areas with all the implications for access to GPs and hospital places and traffic and all of that? And I heard on one pod, do certain constituencies really want lots of affordable housing coming onto the market? Because what will that do to the value of people's houses, which are now basically their main asset and which they've massively overpaid for? What will happen if the whole nation is suddenly in negative equity, even if affordable housing could deliver that kind of drop in prices? So ultimately, I think the Conservatives ended up removing things like the 5-year land supply, duty to cooperate, because all these things put pressure on local authorities to consent speculative housing schemes in the shires. And they emphasized design codes and guides to delivering beautiful places. And they championed localism, local leaders, which they said would help regenerate towns and cities, restore pride in local places. But did that lead to more development or less development? And they obviously took onshore wind offline. They made a lot of positive DCO decisions. Over 90% of schemes were consented. But towards the end, I think we did notice the schemes involving tall, long, winding things through the countryside were put on ice for quite a long time. But I think Labour is different. They're not fussed by a lot of that because they're consistently speaking to, and they've said change the NPPF is only their first step. They plan to do so much more, air quotes. And there's this proposed planning and infrastructure bill which is going to come forward. Some of it sounds pretty routine and the kind of thing the last government spoke about, making sure planning committees have the necessary expertise they need, planning departments being properly funded through charging developers, and everyone wants to streamline the delivery process even more for big pieces of infrastructure. But I think some things only Labour can really do because it doesn't really harm their base. You were talking before about benchmark land values and reforming CPO. And I think Angela Rayner said to make sure that landowners are paid fair but not excessive compensation. So if landowners probably aren't a massive chunk of the people who vote for you, then that means you can maybe deliver something. But the devil's in the detail, because I think the Labour government will be very mindful about how tweaking things can lead to the market doing very unhelpful things if you don't really think through all of the next steps. And so I know that Ardent is thinking very much about the implications of messing around with hope value and benchmark land values. And you were talking before about sites coming off the market. So there is scope here to unlock a lot more affordable housing. There is scope for Labour to unlock large numbers of labs, gigafactories, data centres and electricity grid connections outside of cities in terms of consents, because they can afford to push the boat out a bit, I think, in terms of policies. I think there's a thread that we probably can't touch on too much on, but what are the other factors holding back development? And there are things around kind of construction costs and incentives and all manner of things, which mean planning is always touted as the problem, but is it really the problem?
Both the problem and, according to the government, the solution. So a lot of weight to bear on the shoulders of the planning world. That's brilliant. A very comprehensive review of the proposals. Going to be interesting to watch in the coming months what's implemented, what the impact is. As you say, fundamentally, development will be key to economic growth and sustainable growth, or it'll be a big factor. And it's something that can benefit society as a whole, what with the housing prices, affordable housing, the route to net zero, etc. So as I said, there are some interesting proposals. It's important the government carefully reviews the responses before implementing. But lastly, I just want to say thank you to Giles and Sheridan again for joining us. It's been really illuminating and useful, I hope, for the listeners. And I hope you can join again in the future.
Thank you.
So there we have it. Some great insights on the government's proposed updates to the NPPF, which the government hopes will stimulate development to lead to economic and sustainable growth. The aim is to meet ambitious housing targets, provide much needed affordable housing, target promotion of key growth industries, and ensure the transition to clean power. So it's another watch this space, really, to see what the government ultimately seeks to implement and the impact on these industries. All that's left for me to do is to thank our guests, Jon Stott from Ardent and Giles Pink and Sheridan Treger from BCLP for joining the podcast. And thank you for listening. Please can subscribe and join us next time for Ardent Talks, Regeneration and Development.